as a secondary issue to the balance problems of 5th edition compared to martial versus caster, there's also the issue of ranged versus melee. The 5e is designed very specifically, and from what I can tell, absolutely intentionally, to discourage melee combat at every turn. In a large part, it does this by being too fair, which sounds like a weird thing to say. So what it is it doesn't give any specific mechanics to support melee characters. And as a result, the real world issue, it comes into the game, which is that, in real life, if you're in a life or death situation, if you're in combat, you want to be as far away from the enemy as possible. Ranged attacks, in our world, guns, or in a medieval setting, potentially, arrows, crossbows, things like that. Those are pretty much always preferable if you can use them, compared to getting up next to the opponent where they are going to be able to hurt you in order to try to hurt them. This is a real life thing, and in a way, that is a point of realism for 5th edition. But it is realism at the cost of gameplay, because melee characters, melee warriors, are such a strong fantasy archetype that having a whole system revolving around discouraging that from ever happening is a weird design choice. And so I'd like to go over a few things about what games can do to support melee to even out melee versus ranged combatants and make it so that it is not always a bad idea to get next to the enemy. And you have two basic schools of thought here. You have your narrative-focused games, Blades in the Dark, Powered by the Apocalypse, a few others. The games where your positioning doesn't really matter. It's largely narrative. It's not it is part of the narrative, but it is not part of the mechanics. You don't have a movement speed. You don't have a move action. You can kind of be anywhere that your character can reasonably get to. In those games, melee and ranged attacks are mechanically either identical or equivalent in terms of the risks involved. You're going to make your roll, and if your roll doesn't go too well, you're going to take damage too. Or in some systems, you take damage regardless, and it's just a matter of how much compared to how much you're dealing to the enemy. This is also, as I mentioned in the opportunity attack video, kind of a realistic proposition, which is that if you're going into melee, you are also risking being hurt. Attacking with a melee weapon is the most dangerous part of using a melee weapon. It's where you are most vulnerable. So there's that, and you can sort of make it so that there's no mechanical distinction between melee and ranged, and this is good for that context. It makes sense for those kinds of games, and I don't have any problems with that. But it's not super applicable to Dungeons and Dragons and similar heavier, more basically, if you're playing on a grid, it's not really it's not a really valid solution. Because you do care about movement, you do care about positioning, and so you can't just hand wave the difference between a melee and a ranged attack. You also don't have the exchange of damage built into the resolution mechanic for violence. So in that case, what you have to do is, I would point towards systems like 4th edition. Obviously, I'm always going to be pointing towards 4th edition when it comes to fixing 5th edition. Before I get into the specifics of how 4th edition does it, I do want to say that I have played very small amount of Pathfinder 2nd edition. It didn't agree with me. It's not really my style of game. But I recognize certain things that it does as well. I wouldn't necessarily be able to articulate it that well. So I might need to do more research and then come back with a second video on that. But also, I'm getting Lancer in when the reprint comes out, and I'm really excited for that. And I'm really intrigued to see how Lancer addresses this problem. If you know how Lancer does it, give me a synopsis, a little brief pitch on how Lancer solves the melee versus range problem, leave it in the comment, and I will look into that and maybe make another video on that. That'd be really cool. But I have two basic systems that are mechanically heavier, like comparable with D&D, comparable with 5e, but handle melee versus ranged very differently. I keep having this burn on my finger. Enter frame. I fried some bacon the other day and the bacon bit back. Worth it though. Absolutely worth it. So we'll start with 4th edition. 4th edition has melee characters. It has a few characters that can do melee or ranged. Those are pretty uncommon. And actually that's like considered a strength of those specific classes, the versatility of being able to go into melee or range. But most of the time you either have a ranged class or a melee class, and you don't do a lot of switching back and forth. So melee classes, really like they kind of have to be in melee to have their kit turned on. And the reason why it's fine for them to go into melee and why it's not really fine for 5th edition characters to go into melee is A, their entire kit turns on in melee. They don't really have any range support, as opposed to 5th edition characters that pretty much universally can operate at range at pretty much full capacity. So there's no incentive in 5th edition to go into melee. And second, player characters that are designed to go into melee, particularly the defender types, like they just bully the monsters. They can like really wade into the thick of things, and like the monsters don't want to attack them because they're the worst possible target. They have the most hit points, the highest defenses, and because of the way 4th edition healing works, they're actually like the best target for the party to focus their healing on. So like they're the worst target available for the monsters to focus on, but they lock down the enemy. So you have the threateningness, which kind of factors into what I was talking about with opportunity attacks. The fact that you can make an opportunity attack for every monster, on every turn instead of just once per round, means that you have a lot more stickiness inherent in your character. So if you have this great sword and you're doing a ton of damage per swing, is a monster going to risk that coming at them for free? Because it costs you nothing, functionally. You get a opportunity attack specifically for that creature. It does not stop you from making an opportunity attack on the next creature. And you're going to be doing, a quarter of their health, a third of their health. If you spec, really hard into damage, maybe half their health in a single hit. Like, that's a terrifying proposition for the monster. I'm not going to do it. So you're going to stay in melee, even if you don't want to. Focusing on a target you have no real chance of taking down before the end of the fight. It's even better in this case because you can, because 4th edition has monsters that really don't want to be in melee. 5th edition has a few of these. They're very rare. Nearly every monster in 5th edition is either better in melee or just as good in melee. So they don't really have any incentive to stay at range. If that's where they want to be, then that's where they're going to stay. It doesn't cost them anything. 4th edition monsters, if they are artillery, they want to be away from the enemy. Getting them locked in melee is absolutely a death sentence for them. And 4E player characters are really good at being able to target those guys, get into melee, and unlock them down there. And so that really rewards the melee playstyle in ways that you don't really get in 5th edition just because the monsters aren't set up to reward it. So ranged focused monsters that super do not want to be in melee. You have opportunity attacks per creature's turn instead of per round. And also, the other big drawback of melee is that you can't really choose your positioning very well, and you have to get close to the enemy. So there's a movement tax, if you want to think of it that way, in order to get into a position where you can attack. And that's where the charge action comes in. So in 4th edition, you can charge as a basic action. Anyone can take it. As a standard action, you move your full speed in a straight line towards the enemy until the closest point from which you can attack them, and then you make a basic attack at them with a +1 bonus. And that means that like you aren't forced to double move into melee and then do nothing. It's exceedingly rare that a 4th edition character doesn't get to attack on their turn. They don't get to do something special. nearly every time you're going to be interacting with the enemy, even as a melee character, because having charge as a basic option encourages and supports melee characters. Removing it as a basic option and making it a feat is absolutely Wizard of the Coast saying we don't want melee to work as well. So those three factors are the real big deals. There's actually, like, the defender character type is entirely about, like, getting into melee and staying there and keeping the enemy close to you because you have the highest defenses, the highest hit points, etc., etc. And, like, that doesn't really exist in 5th edition at all. Looking at 5th edition characters, there's no one except arguably the paladin and the barbarian. They have significant parts of their kit that only work in melee, and like it's still not really worth it to do that. Like, paladins probably shouldn't smite half as often as they tend to. Barbarians honestly don't need to exist. Barbarians are real bad. They should just play another character. The barbarians, oh man, I could get into it. I think I already did. Barbarians are more of a liability to their party than a help most of the time. If you're looking at, like, a really high difficulty encounter, you're probably better off without the barbarian, because then you don't have to worry about hurting the barbarian with your AoEs. Is just going to get in the way and eat up healing spells. So anyways, the other system that does melee just as well as ranged is Legend of the Five Rings. Now, I have mentioned before that Legend of the Five Rings doesn't have a great combat system in general, but what it does do is it really supports the melee archetype. And it does this simply by giving way more options to melee characters than to ranged characters. The martial techniques are called katas, and you have general katas that can be used for any attack, and then you have ranged katas and you have melee katas. But there's, I think, more than twice as many melee katas as there are for ranged katas. In addition to this, the nature of the setting is such that characters want to use melee weapons over ranged weapons, even when ranged weapons might be mechanically superior. Just for, like, cultural purposes. You know, there's more honor in wielding a katana than wielding a bow. So, I mean, that's a relatively minor aspect, I would say. The big part is just that there's a wealth of special techniques that you can use with melee weapons that can't be used with ranged weapons. Much more than the reverse. Those are my immediate thoughts on how other games work with making melee better. Not better, but it equalizes melee and ranged. You have narrative games that basically just treat them as the same mechanic. You have crunchier games that encourage and support melee, and it considers the inherent problems in melee. Because, like, in real life, as I said, melee is not usually the right play. If you have the option of attacking at range, you should probably do that. So you have to think very explicitly about what it is that's going to encourage players to engage in what is, by default, a very suboptimal. I've done this before. A very suboptimal strategy. It can be done. It has been done. And 5th edition actually undid it. So let it not be said that it is an unassailable problem. It is just a problem that 5e refuses to address.